This is probably a pretty popular GPU I'm looking at. The NVIDIA RTX 3060 Ti. This is quite a step up from the things I've been testing previously. This is my buddy's GPU that he's been using for the past few years, but he just wanted to upgrade. So I was like, let me test it out before we go and sell it. Released in December of 2020 for $400. But we know how 2020 and 2021 went. It was a long time until it was available for the correct price. There was some good deals to follow in the following years, but realistically it was not something most people could obtain at release. But it was pretty cool. From my understanding, it was very similar to a 3070, but for a good amount cheaper, with no huge negatives at the time. It has 4864 CUDA cores and 38 SM count. From my understanding, that is similar to a compute unit in an AM GPU, and that's the only reason why I mentioned that. The cores run at a clock speed of 1665 megahertz, but it's more like 1800 megahertz. As we know, modern GPUs kind of have more variable clock speeds. It had 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 at 448 gigabytes a second. Oh, and that's where we hit the issue. AMD's RX 6700 XT at the time had 12 gigabytes of memory, and the 6800 had 16 gigabytes of memory, compared to 8 gigabytes for the 3060 Ti and the 3070. Now, back in 2021, might not have seemed like a huge issue, but to me it seems like an issue considering all the way back to the 1070 still had 8 gigabytes. This is multiple generations newer, and it still only has 8 gigabytes of memory. This is where the NVIDIA VRAM shortage problem started in this generation, considering the 3080 only had 10 gigabytes as well. But at the time, it was enough, and as you'll see in the games I tested today, it generally isn't a problem with realistic settings for the GPU power. But I wouldn't recommend getting 8 gigabytes for modern gaming anymore. Definitely don't buy a new GPU with only 8 gigabytes of memory. Go used or make a way up to the 16 and 12 gigabyte GPUs. Another thing I wouldn't recommend, even though it's an RTX card, is ray tracing. It just doesn't quite have the power for it. Maybe some older games and some mods, but in the truly transformative games, I wouldn't recommend it. You're going to get a much better experience with just rasterized performance. I deem this a 1440p card, considering 1440p monitors have gotten so cheap. Of course, there's expensive, nice OLED monitors, but they've even come down to like $400. But you can get 1440p high refresh rate monitors for like less than $200 nowadays. And I feel like this is the threshold of where 1440p becomes more than usable. Alright, enough blabber. How does it perform? In Rise of the Tomb Raider 2016, at 1440p maximum settings, I went in and changed every setting to the highest it would go. I got 122 FPS with a 1% low of 60. Absolutely incredible, a high refresh rate single player experience, pretty smooth, and looks really good too. Rise of the Tomb Raider felt wonderful on this. If we go over to a multiplayer game, Battlefront 2, I did a couple different maps of Galactic Assault, I believe, and at 1440p Ultra preset, I got an average of 123 and a 1% low of 91. Now these aren't competitive games, I would say, but they're still multiplayer shooters, so having that first-person view and high refresh rate does help. Now, obviously this game is also a third-person game if you want it to be, but still, using a mouse and trying to shoot is nicer at a higher refresh rate. I was actually surprised that the average was only 123, because most of the time when I was playing the game, it was above that. Again, an older game feels excellent at 1440p maxed out settings. Forza Horizon 4, 2018, 1440p max settings, 137 FPS with a 105 1% low. What I'm actually worried about here is, am I CPU bottlenecked? I do have a 5700X3D, but these frame rates are so high that I actually don't know, and I have no intention of upgrading my CPU anytime soon. I just found it funny, for these higher end GPUs, it might be an issue. If I go to Jedi Fallen Order 2019 Epic preset, I got an average of 108 and a 1% low of 41. Now, that 1% low isn't too great, but that's, from my understanding, the way these Jedi games work. They are slightly stuttery, they don't shader compile all the way, so there's a couple stutters when new stuff happens, but overall the performance was excellent, and it looked fantastic. 2019's Need for Speed Heat, 1440p Ultra, would you guess? 84 FPS with a 1% low of 58, so even the lows are above 60. This card is perfect for a 1440p VRR experience. All of those were tested at native 1440p. The next few games I'm going to test, I used DLSS quality, still at 1440p, but there is upscaling involved. But if you have an RTX GPU, I would highly recommend DLSS anyway. Maybe just not at 1080p, but at 1440p and 4K, I would use it. So in Red Dead Redemption 2, 1440p, max settings with DLSS quality, I got 80 FPS as an average and a 40 as a 1%. You could probably turn that down 2 notches and get a much better experience, but I thought 80 FPS in a third-person story game is plenty, and it felt and looked great. Now to probably one of our newest games and most demanding, Hogwarts Legacy 2023. 1440p DLSS quality high. So I'm not at max settings anymore, but that makes sense. High is generally a really good experience in most games, and it gives you a good performance boost. I got an average of 83 FPS and a 1% low of 49. Again, a wonderful experience, more than happy, better than what the consoles can provide. That's one of the great things I love about PC is you can have higher frame rates, higher resolutions, better settings, or just customize it to your experience versus consoles where the developer just chooses options for you. And Hogwarts Legacy is a great example of getting a much better experience than a console. I'm going to end off here with a couple multiplayer games that can be a little bit more demanding. Now, Fortnite's not demanding, but I wouldn't recommend turning on Lumen or Nanite, even though they are nice. The frame rate for a competitive shooter is just not high enough in my opinion. But, you know, you definitely can with this GPU. But with just high settings without Nanite or Lumen, I got an average of 148 and a 1% low of 58. Fortnite always has a little bit of stutters, especially your first couple games, and then it smooths out as you keep playing. But this was plenty, and it felt great on a 140 Hz monitor. Now, one of the more or less optimized games you could say is Marvel Rivals. It seems to be performing a little better than it used to, but it's still a long way to be where it needs to be, especially for the visual return. But if I do 1440p DLSS quality, low settings but high textures, this game doesn't seem to use a ton of VRAM anyway, I got an average of 94 FPS and a 1% low of 79, so actually quite stutter free and pretty close to 100 FPS. This is the low preset. Now you can turn down settings even farther to probably get a little higher FPS, but at that point there's a lot of lost art, I would argue. But I know competitive shooters, people just want the most performance. But, you know, I would still say 1440p DLSS at 94 FPS is pretty good. Now for the newest, I played Battlefield 6 RedSec with DLSS quality in the medium preset. I got an average of 87 and a 1% low of 67. Oh no, 67. I'm so sorry, I hate it just as much as you guys. Anyway, again, this game is very well optimized and looks pretty good at medium settings. If you want your military shooter instead of your cartoony shooter, this seems like a good way to go. And with this GPU, it ran pretty well. I will say, the RTX 3060 Ti kind of impressed me today. I was surprised with how many games I could just turn it all the way up at native resolution and it just worked perfectly. Now, I don't have a ton of modern, brand new games on here, but I guess if you keep your expectations in check, this is still a pretty good GPU. I think this GPU will last the console generation with reasonable settings. I would recommend 1440p and DLSS quality in most situations on newer games. It just opens up a little bit of VRAM and a little bit of performance for you. And most games at medium, high settings are still pretty good, with the more demanding games maybe needing to go to low. But I think my target for this GPU would probably be 1440p DLSS with medium settings on modern games. The GPU is just over 5 years old, and I would say it probably gave the people that had the GPU and still have it a pretty good experience. Now, there is a lot of concerns about 8GB GPUs, and I wouldn't recommend that to anybody to go buy this. But if you can get it for really cheap it might be worth considering. They seem to be about $250, $300 when I've looked. Maybe you could get cheaper. I don't know if it's worth it at that price. I think a Intel Arc B580 would probably be a better choice. That still has a modern upscaler and ray tracing, but it also has 12 gigabytes of memory. Now, trusting Intel might be hard because they have a lesser track record, and or if you're going to be mostly playing older games, this is still probably a better way to go. But there's probably better options. You look at the used market, look at what you can get. But I will say the RTX 3060 Ti was not a disappointing card to review. It actually is a pretty good GPU. I was quite impressed by all the performance I got out of it. Thank you all for watching. Take care.